Yo, what's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Michael Morris. We are currently, I believe, 66% load shed, as in the people on this podcast. I have power, but my two co-panelists do not, so we apologize for any break in the signal that may result from such a thing. But anyway, one of those load shed people is Mr. Michael Morris in Cape Town. Michael, how are you doing?
Bearing up, thank you very much. I mean, I think it shows the resourcefulness and resilience of South Africa that, despite this chronic condition, we soldier on. We have sources of light and power and internet and so on. Let's pray that they last.
Well, that's actually maybe part of the problem. I mean, my parents were away recently, and they came back and they said, why are people not nearly as outraged as they should be? I mean, people are grumpy, but, you know, in some countries, this would cause the government to fall.
I think I did surprise my eldest son, who lives in Brussels, at the weekend by saying, closing off a brief WhatsApp note about the fact that we were being load shed with the words "firing squad at dawn," and I think that struck him as rather unusually violent sort of response from me. But anyway, that's how I was feeling at the time. So I think there is I think we're reaching the level of tolerance is coming to an end. So.
Indeed,
for me, anyway.
And of course, the other load shed person on this podcast is Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, how are you doing?
I'm well. I must say that's the reason for my slightly odd aspect ratio and the fact that my hands look massive.
It's just because you've been doing a lot of gym, and so you wanted to show off your chest, which is presumably why the camera is pointing at your chest.
Well, the problem is the angle I'm sitting at is mostly it's emphasizing my gut. So less than being expanding muscularly, I've been expanding in a culinary manner. Well, at least that's the excuse I'm giving. It's the aspect ratio of the camera, but I do think that we are reaching a point of hotfulness that we haven't reached before, and it's almost as if the South African people have every now and again found a reason not to go there. Every time there was just enough of a hint of hope, and I do think part of why we are now at this hotfulness is Ramaphosa's reputation as competent and a billionaire was sort of part of the faith South Africans still had over the last few years. And the fact that this now chimes with the Farmgate thing, I do think sort of plays into the psychology of going, okay, so that card we're not going when there's no card left to play, so we might as well play the hotful.
I think that's a pretty good point. In politics, when it rains, it pours. And I think Cyril's feeling that right now. But actually, let's get into that. So our first story for today, it's kind of a two-parter one here. The first part is a News 24 story about the ANC's National Executive Committee meeting recently. So just a reminder, the National Executive Committee of the ANC is, in essence, the most powerful body in the country, because the ANC doesn't really see this distinction between state and party very clearly. And so the NEC has an enormous amount of power to make decisions about the country, including to remove the president, in effect. So the NEC was meeting to discuss what to do about stage 6 load shedding, which is returning this evening. And they were unable to discuss it because the anti-Ramaphosa faction of the National Executive Committee managed to turn the entire discussion into a debate about why had Ramaphosa not appeared before the ANC's Integrity Commission yet in relation to the accusations made against him with regards to Farmgate and his Pala Pala game farm and the cover-up of the theft of the money there. They said basically that he was swanning around in going to the Southern African Customs Union meeting and the G7 meeting rather than submitting himself before the mercy of the ANC's Integrity Commission. Look, personally, if I was him, I probably wouldn't be that afraid of the ANC's Integrity Commission. Anyway, so the ANC paralyzed, it seems, and unable to discuss the crises that are afflicting the nation. And at the same time, Helen Zille on social media managed to cause a little bit of a storm, as she does from time to time, talking about how really focusing on Jacob Zuma as the agent, as the sort of progenitor of state capture, is just really the wrong way to look at things. Because at the end of the day, state capture is part of the ANC's project of the National Democratic Revolution, a policy which it has endorsed every single elective conference it's had, and it began implementing it in South Africa when it took over in 94. And it has kind of continued this process through Thabo Mbeki, Zuma, and of course, still into Cyril Ramaphosa's time. Zille said, quote, it's a fundamental misreading to put South Africa's malaise down to Zuma. Cadre deployment started under Nelson Mandela, driven with aggressive BEE under Thabo Mbeki. Zuma used it to complete state capture, all a continuum of the National Democratic Revolution. Max never got that. I think she's speaking about Max Price there, or Max Duplessis. Anyway, she then also went on to say, that's why I laughed out loud when I heard our president's promise to end state capture in the ANC's January 8th statement. He has no idea what the concept is. So all of this in our pre-show discussion, Michael, it got you thinking about the way that the media and the sort of opinion pages talk about the ANC and kind of some changes you've been noticing. Do you want to maybe elaborate on that a bit?
Indeed. I can't remember who it was, possibly about a month ago or 2-3 weeks ago. Somebody in the media wrote about how frustrated and irritated he or she had become at the sort of self-fascinated ANC groupies, sort of busying themselves with analysing the intricacies of ANC factional politics and the inner workings of the party, and kind of signaling how clever they were to be in the know and to be well connected and so on and so familiar.
Right, to have that crucial access. They get the WhatsApp with the gossip,
all of that. When in fact, what is becoming increasingly clear is that the relevance of all this nonsense is actually crumbling away by the day, and that there is actually a growing groundswell among all kinds of people who you wouldn't necessarily have thought would be able to reach that position, accepting that this is not about Zuma, it's not about corruption, it's not about factions who have got some dastardly ambition. It is the quality of the ANC, the quality of the ANC government. We see them behaving as if they're a normal party running a normal country, and everybody knows it's a mess, and they're presiding over it, and they are responsible for it. There was a very interesting. You mentioned the number of people now emerging in the media who are saying very forthright things. One of these at the weekend was City Press editor Mondli Makanya responding to the absolutely egregious and outrageous statement last week from Motsoaledi, Aaron Motsoaledi, Home Affairs Minister, about the this new
foundation.
Exactly.
Yeah, we talked about that on Thursday's episode, I think.
That's right, indeed. And he was kind of blaming people who knew nothing about South Africa's history, who disregarded the sacrifices made in the struggle and so on. He even mentioned people with white skin. I mean, how absolutely outrageous is that? Who now are criticizing the ANC, and that this must stop. This must be nipped in the bud. And there was a very final line from Mondli, where he says what needs to be nipped in the bud as soon as possible, which is the words that Motsoaledi used, is the anti-democratic push and near incitement to violence that emanates from the mouths of powerful individuals. And I think that's a very, very important, powerful statement. And the significance of it, I think, is that more and more people are adopting this view. So, yeah, the ANC is, desperate, I think. I think it realizes, perhaps for the first time in 28 years, it realizes that it's facing the wall, and there's a crisis looming.
I think that's exactly right. And it's just kind of interesting how all of this sort of seems to happen at once. If you talked a year ago about and described, you said that the media would be so aggressive about Ramaphosa and would be attacking him so much. It would seem almost a little bit fanciful, because even last year there was still a strong trend of Ramaphosa kind of in the air. And it's incredible to me, at least, how quickly so much of this has turned. And now, groups like the IRR, like ourselves, are suddenly finding ourselves sort of pretty much in line with a lot of mainstream criticism. Hermann, what do you make of all this?
Yeah, no, I do think it is fascinating to think that we are only about 2 years on from Adrian Basson calling President Ramaphosa majestic, probably the most nauseatingly sycophantic description of a country leader by anyone other than a loyal cadre of the party. It really was just peak Ramaphosa, and I think Ramaphosa died pretty soon, but then there was a buy-in of Rama delusion, where Ramaphosa was, I think one could see as a general hopefulness, where there might be reason to be joyful and to be optimistic. Then we went into an era of Rama delusion, where there was active reason not to be optimistic, but many people just refused to see it. And I think the real damage for Ramaphosa is now coming back to bite him, and that is the fact that he isn't a good politician. He is blunderous in political strategy, and he's not a great communicator. He is flat-footed. Any other serious politician in the ANC, I think, bar perhaps Angie Motsekga, would have been able to respond to this sort of scandal with more alacrity and more insight and more urgency, and thereby, sort of protect the political capital that they've got left. And Ramaphosa just didn't do that. He sort of, in a weird, bizarre way, never swung into action to defend his political capital in the Sparmgate situation. And I think that, more than anything else, perhaps has led to the end of Rama delusion, is not consciously, but subconsciously the idea of a strong leader is what makes a strong leader a strong leader. And if the reputational positioning is such that someone who many in the media had perceived to be a strong leader, if there isn't any even possible claim to a strength of their current position, then the cards start falling very, very swiftly. It's the old Hemingway thing, slowly and then all at once. And I do think the erosion of the ANC's governing credibility is now collapsing around around us, about us, with every single chicken there is coming home to roost. And it's very, very interesting that the crisis meeting of the ANC top brass couldn't come to a point to solve the Eskom problem, and it's in their narrow factional interest not to. It's wonderful for them that the crisis keeps going on, because Ramaphosa is now getting the flack from even some of his most staunch supporters in the commentariat. So it's to their advantage to delay this whole idea of a solution. But at the end of the day, I think what is now becoming clearer than ever is that, yes, there are two factions in the ANC, but it's not the good faction and the bad faction. It is the ideological faction and the opportunistic faction. It is the people who want to tax you, they tax your money away from you, and the people who want to take your money away from you. And both of those end up in a form of state capture, because the one wants to capture the state because they want to drive the state with socialist integrity and the idealism of a utopian for the working class. And the other one wants to capture the state because they want to line their pockets. And it now is becoming such a nebulous contention as to who's got the upper hand within the ANC, because the ordinary citizen experiences the ANC's governance, whether it's idealistic or opportunistic, in exactly the same way. And that is state failure, the likes of which we are experiencing at this very moment.
I must say, I have been quite amazed by, as you say, his sort of political ineptitude. Because for a long time, I really had the impression that Ramaphosa was very skilled at kind of managing his image and that sort of thing. But what we're really seeing is, you look at the anti-Cyril faction, right? We might call it the Ramaphosa faction. It's often erroneously called the RET faction, although, as our colleague, Mr. Krause, often makes the point that that's really not an accurate description. But despite the fact that the anti-Cyril faction are discredited in the media, they're out of, they've lost a lot of places in the ANC. I don't think they control the majority of the provinces anymore. They've got the sort of stink of corruption about them. All these things, and yet they still are able to use what little power they have to really pin Ramaphosa to the wall every single time and have him running around in circles, and he never seems to be able to hit back at them. I mean, it took him ages to get Ace Magashule out, but even so, Ace is still, not in jail, and is still kind of
a blunder, a massive blunder in that regard. That's completely Ramaphosa's fault, is not to act swifter against Arthur Fraser, the cause of his current reputational headache. He had Arthur Fraser at his mercy and didn't do anything to neutralize him. I'm not saying kill him. I mean, we're not
yes,
we're not the KZN.
Let the wheels of justice. Let the wheel of justice actually sort of roll forward, because that's one of the great advantages that Ramaphosa had, which is so many of his opponents within the ANC have some sort of credible allegation of corruption against them. And if he had just let the prosecuting authorities do its job, they probably would have destroyed most of his internal opposition. But of course, he seems to have prioritized the unity of the party. And by prioritizing the unity of the ANC, he's managed to get a disunited ANC and an unpopular presidency and a failing state all at the same time. It's quite and
what compounds the situation is Ramaphosa's background. His leadership experience prior to his political career was in the union movement, and his consensus-seeking approach worked in the union movement because that was all that was necessary for the unions at that time. Just broad unity to provide.
Their allies were in government, and they were sycophants in business.
Yes, so his leadership style, if you want to put people like Arthur Fraser and Ace Magashule and even David Mabuza, really hardcore political players, of some of the most nefarious shades in politics, and you are a consensus-seeking president. I mean, there's a small part of me that feels pity for Mr. Ramaphosa. He's trying to play. They are playing, to use the metaphor quite often incorrectly applied to him. He's playing checkers and they're playing chess.
Any final thoughts, Michael, before we move on?
I thought Hermann used a very useful description of the ANC in those two factions, both actually wanting your money, but in different ways, and both kinds of practice leading to the same event, which is collapsed state. And I think people that's beginning to dawn on people. It is precisely that there is no option for a better kind of government, which I think is also really the challenge that the country faces now, because it needs now to focus very much on not what to do with the ANC, but what to do after the ANC. That to me is really the big challenge.
Right, and that's the wild blue ocean ahead of us that we still need to chart a course through. But anyway, let's move on to our next topic, and we're staying with Ramaphosa here, but it is some comments that the president made in his weekly newsletter this morning. And this is about the problems with underage drinking. So it's a bit of it's not really a surprise to anyone, I think, that underage drinking is a really big problem in the country. And recently we've seen something that, while not strictly connected necessarily to underage drinking, in the sense that it was caused by underage drinking, this is definitely, we're seeing some of the negative effects of it. And in this case, I'm sure everyone saw that story in East London where 21 children, and I think an adult as well, died from, it's not clear what, in an East London pub, probably carbon monoxide poisoning. And they're going to all be buried this week. The teenagers were aged between 13 and 17. And there's now a big investigation into the building standards of this tavern that all of these kids died in. You know, why wasn't it ventilated properly? Why did it not comply with any safety regulations? But this is not a particular surprise. There's large parts of the country where building planning basically doesn't take place, and there's very little in terms of, corruption-free keeping track of buildings. But that aside, the president said that, the real issue here is that, the fact that there were a whole bunch of under 18s in a tavern drinking and apparently receiving free alcohol, according to an advert that advertised the event, which led to all of these kids being in there. And the president said, the increased social acceptability of young people drinking alcohol has become a serious problem in a country where the majority of the drinking population are already classified by the World Health Organization as binge drinkers. The proliferation of establishments openly flouting the law points to failings on the part of authorities to enforce regulations. And there are also some references in his newsletter to other incidents where similar things have happened. There was a nightclub in Durban in 2000 where 13 children aged 11 to 18 died in a stampede after someone threw a tear gas canister into a pub. And then some other ones, for example, in Khayelitsha, where there was a stair that collapsed where a whole bunch of children were killed. The local community, for their part, said that the only reason the kids were in there is because there's nothing to do in their community. There's a lack of sports, learning, and other developmental facilities for younger people, leading to them to resort to, quote, tavern hopping. Hermann, government has from time to time kind of attempted to, come up with some new legislation around underage drinking, normally with what is, I think, generally a pretty unproductive approach, which is to raise the drinking age to 21. We've seen that proposed a few times. What should government be doing to curb underage drinking?
Well, I'll try to get to that, but let me lead up to that answer with what I hope is coherent reasoning. The first thing is, it's very, very telling that Ramaphosa's sorry, it's my dog now just demanding attention. I think one of the first problems is that the ideological intent of the president becomes so clear. The problem is profit-seeking, exploitation, and the solution is regulation and state intervention. Boiled to its essentials, that is what the president is saying here. The people who seek to profit from the abuse of our precious future, bad, and therefore state solution, good. However, I am pretty convinced by the studies I've seen, and just by the common sense so rare among politicians and highly educated people, that social problems really cannot be solved from a central governmental point. They can be caused by a central government. And I think one of the most blatant examples of this was really the apartheid government fracturing families through so many means that at the end of the day, you removed the moral safeguard and the moral safety net of the community and the family and accountability of parents to children and vice versa and so on. So the solution here seems, to my mind, to be in search of restoring those things that led to this collapse of moral fiber in the first place. And that, to my mind, I think are mostly economic levers that the state can primarily pull. Social levers are incredibly difficult for the state to navigate. I mean, only look at the abortion debate in America. That is an issue that is so divisive, mostly because the disagreement comes from what central government should do about the issue. And social issues are notoriously awful and difficult for governments to solve. So they should focus on what they can do. And in that regard, education, youth employment, infrastructure for the creation of local business, those are the obvious things that won't have immediate effects of solving this problem, but will logically start reversing the negative trends that have led to this pessimistic, nihilistic, depressing lifestyle of South Africa's youth. Think about it. Vast youth unemployment, bad education that doesn't equip them to actually become productive problem solvers, an economic circumstance where you can't just take initiative and start a business on your own, and then taken on top of that, this comes after a century of the degeneration, the deliberate degeneration of communities and those traditional sources of moral fiber. So when the president comes here and says, profit bad, government good, it's not that his undergarments are hanging out. It is that he shows us he has nothing but undergarments, and that's a rather harrowing thought, but visual image. But the point is that the idea that this is a problem for government to solve is, I think, cynical, impractical, and I do think it smacks of the flailing. A president seeking to make his ideological assumptions relevant to some tragedy that can connect with his people. I think this is poor politics. It's awful policy, and ironically, and this is my last remark, it shows the conservative prohibitionist instinct that has long undergirded much of the ANC's thinking. This comes back, you see it in the actions of Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma when she was health minister. You see it in Thabo Mbeki refusing to accept the science of HIV and AIDS. There's a sort of what's the word? No, I can't remember. There's a sort of prude conservatism that refuses to face reality and deal with it on a level that could societally make a real difference.
Michael, your thoughts on this issue?
I agree wholly with Hermann. We're talking about the social fabric, which is the consequence of policy making, which is bad. It's no surprise that, in fact, even if it was carbon monoxide poisoning that relates to a generator that was there, the generator was there because of the constant load shedding and power problems, the absence of building plans, insufficient ventilation is again municipal failure. And as a couple of our listeners have been pointing out, it's this tragedy of people who have so little to look forward to, as Hermann has been saying, with massive youth unemployment, prospects nil, education feeble, that having a bit of fun, getting drunk maybe is the only thing you look forward to. So it is all about those things. It's not about underage drinking, really. Whatever that doubtless is a problem, and there are reasons for it, but the reasons are to be found in society, not in the absence of or insufficiency of legislation.
No, definitely. And I'm also, of course, as Hermann's pointed this out, is got all these collapse of the sort of healthy social structures that normally help people along.
Exactly.
A lot of these kids in a lot of the country's worst schools, teachers routinely show up drunk. So it's really difficult to tell kids, hey, when you're 14, you probably shouldn't be getting blackout drunk in a tavern if the majority, or at least a very large percentage of the adults around you, are getting really drunk every day. As the president himself says, we've got a very bad problem with binge drinking overall.
Might I add a very, very small thing to what you're saying now, and this is where it becomes an economic question again, less than a social one. I mean, the three of us, I'm sure, went through high schools and university where paralytic drinking was not uncommon. Our peers, perhaps not the three of us, being fuddy-duddies, engaged in this. But what our peers had the advantage of was a moral and a socio-economic structure that could see them through this phase of stupidity. At the end of it, you had some release from this state of pointlessness where many South Africans just don't.
And exactly. If you went off the rails too much, your parents would probably have a word with you. And if you ran out of money, well, you could probably borrow money from someone without too much trouble. And that really does help. But if you're, poor, don't have a dad, you hang out with the gang sometimes, and you're living off of basically your grandmother's pension, the cushion for any bad decisions you might make as a youth, as all youth do make, is very, very thin. And of course, that can result in terrible things happening. Any final thing on this, Michael, before we close up today?
I think I don't know. We've covered a lot of ground here, and I think all very cogent points. I think that's exactly as the land lies, really, tragically. But that's the challenge we face.
Indeed. And we're not going to fix, as you guys say, these social problems until we get some of the economics right. Now, the social problems won't come right immediately, but we can at least create the space for them to start coming right. And then it will be up to communities probably to fix that for themselves for the most part. But right now, in a country where hope is not readily available for so many people, I think it's the one thing that we do really need to focus on. Anyway, with that, let us call it to a close for today. We are out of time. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. Please subscribe to the video, share it around if you enjoyed it, and give us good ratings on the podcast apps. We also appreciate that if you're listening on audio only. And we will, of course, see you tomorrow on the Daily Fringe Show. Cheers, everyone.